Ever since I shared this video on investigating color theory, I've had dozens of messages and comments asking for an investigation on lighting. So, it's time to slap on our detective caps again and open up a new case. In today's video, we're going to be covering all the basics of light and shadow, how they relate to each other, and how we can combine all of these things to create some pretty cool artwork. I'll be demoing a lot of these concepts in this gouache illustration. Stay tuned till the end to hear the story behind this piece, and finally see the finished miniature kit that it's based on. Now, every good investigation has witnesses. They're the ones who tell us what's what and who's who. They give us context for our case. So let's get ready to meet our witnesses, starting with the Shadows family. Witness number 1, Mr. Cassidy cast shadow. Now, cast shadow appears where the light is blocked, where the light casts a shadow from one object onto another. Let's take a look at a tube of paint. So the main light source is coming from the window behind it. The cast shadow appears where the light doesn't touch. Y'all remember the Shadowlands of the Lion King?
Everything the light touches is our kingdom.
Everything the light touches belongs somewhat to the light.
Or Mufasa, however you want to look at it.
So cast shadows aren't reached by the light, but the shape of the cast shadow is directly affected by the light. That cast shadow takes the shape of the object blocking the light. In this case, it takes the shape of the paint tube. We'll talk more about shapes in a bit. An easy way to remember which type of shadow is which is to remember that cast shadows are not part of the object. Witness number 2, Mrs. Fiona form shadow. Like I said earlier, everything the light touches belongs a little bit to the light. Mrs. Form Shadow was married into the shadow family.
She's a shadow in-law.
So form shadows appear when planes of the object turn away from the light. These form shadows are attached to the object, unlike the cast shadows. Let's look at our tube of paint again. All of these little planes not facing the light are now in shadow. Now, the degree of the angle of those planes impacts how dark in value that shadow is going to be. But all of these little planes are form shadows, even the lightest ones. When you have a curved object such as a bouncy ball or a couch cushion, you're going to have a much softer gradient of form shadows. Whereas in an angular object like a desk or a book, those angles are going to cause the shadows to shift more drastically. Witness number 3, Cornelia core shadow. This is the child of Mr. Cast and Mrs. Form. So core shadows are the darkest part of the form shadow. Now, rarely do we have just one light source in a scene, but even if we do have only one, that light is still going to be bouncing around and impacting the planes of our object. The core shadow is darkest because it's the least impacted by our primary light source and any bounce light. But we'll talk about bounce light in just a little bit. Now let's bring in our next group of witnesses, the light family. Witness number 4, Madam Kendra Key Light. She's the top dog, the queen bee,
The head honcho, if you will.
of lighting. What she says goes. She's the strongest of our light family, kind of like a bodybuilder. Our key light is always going to be the primary light source. No matter what other sources of lighting there are in the scene, she's still the one with the most influence. In our paint tube photo, our key light is that window light. It's our strongest light source. Witness number 5, Mr. Philip Fill Light. Now, Mr. Fill is a secondary light source that is typically opposite of the key light and illuminates the form shadows of the objects facing away from the key light. Fill light likes to create more clarity in the shadows. So off screen in this picture, there's a window to the left of our paint tube and a ceiling light over the top. Both of these lights are fill lights. They aren't nearly as strong as our key window light, but they are lightening up the shadows on the planes facing away from the key light. Witness number 6, Bonnie Bounce Light. Also goes by the name of reflected light. Bounce light appears when the light source or sources hit another object and bounce onto the surrounding objects. It's not a direct form of light. Bounce light is a light in-law. It only occurs when another light source causes it to. Witness number 7, Cousin Henry Halftone. This is the fun, life of the party cousin. Halftones are the space where light transitions to shadow. Halftones are always closer to the lights than to the darks in a piece. Thus, they are part of the light family. Unfortunate naming, since halftones are nowhere near halfway between the lights and the darks.
They're snuggled right up next to the lights.
Our next few light family witnesses are kind of intertwined with key light and fill light. They're variations of them. Witness number 8, Granny Nancy Natural Light. Granny Natural is as old as nature itself.
Want to take a guess what natural light is?
That's right, it's any source of light coming from nature. Sunlight, moonlight, starlight. So in the case of this photo, it's that window light. The light from the ceiling lamp is not natural light because
It is man-made.
natural light can be a fill light or a key light depending on the scene. Witness number 9, Bridget backlight. Backlight is positioned behind a subject and illuminates only the edge or rim of the subject. It gives the subject kind of an outline. So say somebody takes a photo of you in front of a sunset. Most of you is going to be in shadow, but the sun will create a glowing rim of your silhouette. Now backlight can be a natural light or an artificial light, it can be a key light or potentially a fill light. Now let's see how all of these witnesses interact and influence our victims.
Let's not call them victims.
That sounds bad. Our case subjects, the twins, Messieurs Sam Shape and Edgar Edge. Shape and Edge are very much linked together. They're what make a piece either a big blobby mess or a clear, readable work of art. They're what create form in an object. And you can only have form through contrast. If we look at this piece by J.C. Leyendecker and break it down into only 2 values, we see these very clear shadow shapes and light shapes. When it comes to shapes, you gotta kiss. Keep it simple, stupid. Shapes are made up of at least one, if not all of these things: S-curves, C-curves, and straights. When creating shapes, don't make it overly complex and harder than it needs to be. You gotta keep it simple. A good shape makes use of those S's, C's, and straights with nuance. They don't go over the top. You're simply creating some abstract shapes that help you describe the form of an object. Now, like I said, edge is shape's twin. Not the same, but most definitely linked. Edges are our brushwork. They're how we create strong shapes versus soft transitions. Let's say you're taking an evening walk on the beach. The sun is going down to your right. The light hitting you casts a shadow on the ground, and that shadow has varied edges. So when the object casting a shadow is closer to the object it's casting a shadow on, the shadow is clear.
It's crispy.
So that shadow around your feet is going to be much stronger and crispier because it's the closest to the ground. The farther away that object gets from the ground, the softer that shadow becomes. So because your torso and your head are the farthest away from the ground, the shadow is going to be a lot softer. Think of this like a chocolate chip cookie. The crispy bits juxtaposed with the gooier, softer bits makes it interesting and delicious. Combining harsh edges or shapes with soft edges makes your artwork delicious too. Shapes and edges are always interacting with light and shadow. They're working around an object and within an object. For example, oftentimes cast shadows will merge with form shadows and create lost edges. Or maybe our key light bounces off a table onto, let's say, a character's hair, which merges it with the value of the background. It all comes back to that contrast we were talking about. It's not all about describing every form, it's about pointing to the most important pieces of the story. Now let's discuss a couple of different lighting schemes. Aptly named for our investigation.
Schemes.
Anyways, scheme number 1, the high key hills. This is a softer or diffused lighting scheme. Our light source isn't casting a ton of shadows everywhere. It's relatively low contrast. So the illustration I'm painting here would be an example of a high key lighting setup. We have our key sunlight coming in through the window on the left, and a sky blue fill light coming through the window on the right. The morning sunlight itself is relatively soft, but that fill light softens it even more by lighting up the shadows on the planes facing away from our key light. Our shadows are very diffused and don't have many truly hard edges. All of the cast shadows here have been mostly re-illuminated by our fill light and the bounce light happening around the environment, causing an overall well-lit scene. Scheme number 2, the low-key valley, also known as chiaroscuro in the film industry. Low-key lighting is a high-contrast lighting scheme focusing on the juxtaposition of lights and darks. It has a much more serious, more intense look to it than a high-key lighting scheme. This painting by Johannes Vermeer is a great example of a low-key lighting scheme. The low-key or chiaroscuro scheme was used in a lot of Renaissance paintings, and for good reason. It's very dynamic, it's very engaging, it's very expressive. John Singer Sargent used low-key lighting in a lot of his paintings too. As with anything in art, whether it's composition, perspective, color, lighting, values, it all comes back to story. What is the story you're trying to tell? And lighting is a very big factor in telling that story. It creates a mood, it draws our attention where it needs to go. It lets things recede into the shadows or illuminates a specific character or object. And the Disney movie Treasure Planet, which is highly underrated
In my professional opinion, but that's unimportant.
the creators used light and shadow in telling Jim's story of character growth throughout the movie. They placed a shadow shape around his eyes in the beginning of the movie to create more of an edgy, kind of sullen and rebellious look. By the end of the movie, that shadow is removed, giving Jim a fresher, brighter, and more mature appearance. Many horror, thriller, or mystery movies will use a low-key lighting scheme to create a moodier appearance. It gives you that feeling that something's hidden in the dark or that you don't know what's going to happen. It can create a darker, more intense emotion. So in this scene from The Conjuring, we've got this bright matchstick light illuminating the character and a tiny bit of the staircase around her. It's creating a lot of harsh form shadows and cast shadows and puts the background into complete darkness. Now we're not seeing anything in that background, but the lighting gives us that spooky feeling that something's hiding there. Now something like a comedy or a romance or simply a feel-good movie will oftentimes have more of an overall high-key lighting setup. It's going to be brighter and airier, less mystery, more cozy. If we look at this scene from the movie Little Forest, it's a lot brighter, there's a lower contrast, we're getting this warm, cozy key light on the right side, as well as some fill light and bounce light on the left. Everything's pretty well lit. So let's take a look at how I used shadows, lights, shapes, and edges in this piece. Like I mentioned earlier, I created a high-key lighting scheme here. Very bright and very cheerful. We can see some bounce light from the white coffee cups onto the metal of the espresso machine, as well as the light bouncing off of the book spines down onto the wooden bench. We can see here that color is very much affected by lighting, and lighting is affected by color. The book spines change the color of the light to reflect their own color onto the wooden shelf beneath them. That key sunlight on the left warms up the local colors of the objects facing it. Then the sky blue fill light on the right affects the local colors of the objects facing it. For example, the long side of the counter facing the left is warmer and a little bit lighter than the shorter edge being hit by the cooler, weaker fill light. The key warm sunlight is still the primary factor here, but the blue fill light does have its own effect too. This comes back to color temperature and color relativity. Colors are always in transition, affected by lights and shadows and the other colors around them. This is what makes art so confusing sometimes, but it also makes it this amazing puzzle for us to figure out. For instance, warm lighting will oftentimes create cooler shadows and vice versa. Now, like any quote-unquote art rule, this isn't completely set in stone. There are other factors at play sometimes that can change that rule. But it is an easy way to kind of guide your lights and shadows in a relatively good color direction and create a solid color structure for your piece. So let's say you have a cool light source, such as a rainy day. Those shadows will then shift just a little bit warmer, but only in comparison to that cool light. You're not shifting straight from teal to copper, you're just leaning a little bit on the color wheel. Truthfully, lighting is one of my favorite things in a painting, and also one of the things that psychs me out the most. There can be a lot of things to consider, and I tend to get very in my head about it. At the end of the day, you can learn all these concepts and understand them, but you need to create artwork that speaks to you. If that means breaking some of the rules, then go for it. If that means only ever using one lighting scheme cause it's your absolute favorite, then have at it. You need to go with your gut when creating and make the art that you like. But there are ways you can practice lighting and get a better feel for it. So let's talk resources and ways to practice. One of the big exercises that really helped me get more familiar with lighting and create better lighting schemes in my own work was doing still life studies. Not full color studies, but grayscale studies. This really helped me train my eye to better understand the values that I was seeing without the context of color. First, I would do one study, breaking it down into 2 values, or at least pretty close. I do these traditionally with gouache, and it's a little hard to get just 2 values sometimes. Then I would repaint it with a full range of values. This was an exercise I did a lot when I took Robert Kondo and Dai Susumi's color and light class on Schoolism. Let me tell you, it was a very, very quick level up for my lighting skills. Don't get me wrong, it was not at all an easy level up. You have to put in the time and effort, but doing several of these kinds of studies makes a lot of progress very quickly. Pro tip if you want to try this exercise out, squint a lot when doing a 2-value study. Squinting merges the lights with the lights and the darks with the darks while still giving you a clear sense of the object's form. If you're wanting to take a class on lighting, I definitely recommend that color and light class. No, this is not sponsored, but I think it's an amazing class for any artist to take regardless of your medium or style. I also think it's a great class from beginner all the way to pro. There's something for everyone to learn, and it's never a bad thing to do some fundamental drills. If you're looking for a good book, I definitely recommend Devin L. Kurtz's book, Windows to Worlds. Even though it's kind of an overall look at her art journey, there's a lot of great information in there on lighting and color. I mean, you can take one look at her work and know she's got something to say about lighting. I've also made a playlist of some videos here on YouTube that I've found extremely helpful in learning about lighting, so you can check those out in the description. We've finally arrived at the story of this illustration and the final pieces of the miniature coffee shop kit. I know, I started it so freaking long ago, and to be fair, it's been finished for quite a while, but I just hadn't had a chance to share the final pieces with you guys. So when I started this kit, I knew from the beginning that I wanted to revamp it to fit into the American Meadow. I wanted it to be nature-y, I wanted one of the meadow animals to run it, I wanted it to be a bit dilapidated and overgrown with plants and moss. I also wanted to change up the colors and make it a bit more green themed. I also added some cracks and exposed brick, which unfortunately got somewhat covered up by the elements in the kit. Poor planning on my part. I wasn't a fan of most of the papers that the kit included, like the wood grain paper for the floor and the brick paper for the walls, so I did my own brick, and made it 10,000 times harder on myself by making my own floors, too. I used a pair of Sharp Boy plier cutter things to cut these little popsicle stick type wood pieces, and then glued them together to make a plank floor. And then I made a wood stain from watercolors because I hated the color of the wood. But I'm really, really proud of how it turned out. This whole kit was such a fun and different creative activity than what I'm used to. Let me tell you, it challenged my direction reading skills, and I did not put everything together correctly. Anywho, once I saw that the shop's theme was coming up in my 20 illustrations challenge this fall, I realized that this would be the perfect opportunity to explore the Cardinal Coffee Shop in a painting. Now, I didn't paint things exactly as they are in the miniature. I switched some things up a bit, moved some things around, but I wanted the overall general vibe to still be there. I also wanted to add a little raccoon customer and our Cardinal Coffee Shop owner. So I made the bar stools slabs of log, added some more greenery, added a little ZZ plant in honor of Harriet. I also added a little moth down on the boxed plant. And y'all, I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. I think one of my favorite parts was painting the brown paper bags and the little glass jars on top of the shelf. Those kinds of props,
They make my little heart flutter a bit.
Each illustration that I explore more of the American Meadow in makes me not only more excited to see more of the meadow, but also more excited to just paint in general. My artsy mojo has come back with a vengeance lately, and I'm here for it. Ready and willing to paint and create. Anywho, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned a little bit about lighting. I know I did when I was doing some research for this video. Lighting is such an effective form of storytelling, and I hope we can all level up our skills in it together. I also hope you enjoyed watching me paint this illustration and finish my Cardinal Coffee Shop miniature. Huge thank you to the Cozy Club over on Patreon for making this video possible and helping to support my own art journey. Y'all are the real MVPs, and I really, really appreciate you. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye, guys!